commentary pulled up. We were reading from Ellicott. I don't know his first name, otherwise I would say it, but the commentator's last name is Ellicott. Ellicott's commentary in Genesis. Good morning, user 38. I recognize you. And where we left off was a discussion of songs in the time of the prophets. And we learned that the prophets moved around in music groups. Basically, they were traveling bands, and they had harps and flutes and drums, and they would make prophecies through song. And they had disciples sometimes who would write these things down. And David, King David, was part of that. It was trained in that. And I found that so interesting because David, of course, wrote a bunch of songs that turned out to be very important prophecies. So this perspective is really adding up in my mind, and I'm curious to see where it goes from here. Now, once again, as I said last time, we're not even that far into this commentary, so I don't want to waste a lot of time getting into it. Dave in Ajax says, crazy. I hope that's a positive kind of crazy. Let's continue right from where we left off. I'll read the last thing that we were reading, and then we can go from there. It says, the fact that David himself had been trained in those schools, meaning the prophetic schools of song, that from the earliest youth to the extreme old age, his life was illumined with the stars at once of prophecy and of verse. I'm guessing he means here stars of prophecy and of verse. That's kind of a weird way of phrasing it, but made his advent to the throne and the golden time of Hebrew literature. So there would have been a lot of literature produced at the time of David, and that's what we see in the Bible. Curtis says, worship God. Jesus Christ is the spirit of prophecy, Revelation 19:10. You're not lying. You're telling the truth. Guys, thank you for the likes already. Thank you for tuning in nice and early here so we can get started right away. We're only 3 minutes in. More people are obviously going to join. They can watch the replay on YouTube if they want to go back to the beginning, but we are going to start getting into this right away because this is my precious little bit of morning time to do some studying, and I want to squeeze it in while I have time, and I don't want to stay up super late. MJ says, I am Muslim. As a Muslim, I like your content. Well, that is surprising to me, but I have been surprised by many people saying they like my content because I never expect anyone to like it. So my content is for my own sake and for anyone who's interested, no matter your background. Now, here's what it says. The king was known not only, speaking of King David, obviously, the king was known not only as the conqueror and the ruler, but as the, quote, sweet psalmist of Israel. Psalmist, of course, being a songwriter. And every form of composition found in him at once a master and a patron, meaning he funded and helped other people to do this, to create these psalms and write down a bunch of stuff, and he himself was a master of it. The consciousness of national life, which was thus developed, found expression, as it has always done, in the analogous stages of the growth of the other nations in the form of history. Salt of the Earth from YouTube says, hello from England. What time is it there? I think this is what, afternoon? Welcome. Let me read that last phrase again. The consciousness of national life, which was thus developed, found expression, as it has always done, in the analogous stages of the growth of other nations, in the form of history. I guess what he's saying is these Psalms, although they were often just praising God, they also reflected and recounted things that were actually going on at the time, or referenced things that were going on at the time, and so it became a way of recording history and giving praise to God and, admitting their guilt or their need for God or whatever at the same time. So there's a lot of things going on at once, and it becomes a history that forms a national identity. It says, one man felt drawn to search out the origins of his people, and another to record the events in which he and his fathers had actually been sharers. There were the formal official annals, the book of the Chronicles, the work probably for the most part of the priests, and therefore dwelling largely in the organization of the temple, and the changes made during the periods of religious reformation under the kings of Judah and Israel. And besides these, we have traces of copious literature, chiefly the work of prophets, and therefore viewing the history of the people from the prophets' standpoint of faith in a righteous order, working through the history of the nation, such as has been described above in the books of Nathan the prophet and Gad the seer, the book of the Acts of Solomon, which is Kings. 1 Kings 11:41 references, it says, and the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? But we don't have that book. That's interesting. That's something I knew about that, but I forgot. The prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite, the visions of Iddo the seer, the prophecy of Jonah, not found in the book that bears his name, the book of Shemaiah the prophet, of Iddo the seer concerning genealogies, and a third book by the same writer, the book of Jehu the son of Hanani, the Acts of Uzziah and Hezekiah, by Isaiah the son of Amos, and the Lamentations of Jeremiah for Josiah. And each of those examples has a Bible quote: 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, 2 Kings, 1 Kings. These different chronicles that were being made at that time across all those decades or centuries, all these different prophetic books, a lot of which we don't have. We don't have those in the Bible. But the Bible references those books. So the Bible actually records the existence of books that we don't have, but which those people at the time thought were important. Now I want to go back to what this was saying before, because this is very interesting that he says, men felt that they had at once a future and a past. One man felt drawn to search out the origins of his people, and another to record the events in which he and his fathers had actually been sharers. So he's saying that at the time when literature is exploding and the people are settling down and they're conquering and David is leading them and they're getting comfortable with calling themselves a nation that actually, makes their own literature and psalms, and they have prophets and stuff, that's when there would have been this interest in rediscovering their origins. So I guess they would have taken the documents they had and started to incorporate it into their literature and compile records. And that's why eventually you get the book of Chronicles and Kings. But he's not talking about where Genesis and these other books came from. And he didn't say that they were written at the time of the Exodus, although he does talk about the book of the covenant and the book of the law of God back then. So I guess there was the essence, the essence of that time. And then he's been hinting that along this whole time, even though we don't have 100 different little books along the way, that there would have been different kinds of literature that would have survived until these prophets and the time of David. And then that's when they would have written the book of Chronicles. Debbie, good morning. If anyone else wants to say hello, Salt of the Earth, you never answered my question there on YouTube, but go ahead and if you're able to, if you have time to chat, you can tell me more. God Love just showed up in time and gave me a classic blessing, saying, "May the Most High have mercy on us. Father, thank you for everything. In Jesus Christ's name, amen." Blessings, brothers, sister and brothers in Christ. Yeshua's, we love you. Blessings, Terry Wolf. Psalm 67. Sam and Mickey, good morning. It is a good morning. Let's praise God and let's keep trying to learn about his word. Defenders of Jesus Christ, I don't have a coffee or anything to sip with you, but I got some water. Now here's what it goes on to say. Working side by side with each other and taking each a wider range than the mere register of events, which was the work of the recorder of the king's court. Interesting. That's in 2 Samuel 8:16. It says, "And Joab, the son of Zuriah, was over the host, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was recorder." So the Bible in 2 Samuel talks about there being a recorder and gives the name of the person who was recording stuff at the time of Joab. And then in Isaiah 36 it says, "Then came Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, that was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and Joah the son of Asaph, the recorder, to Hezekiah with their clothes rent, and told him the words of Rabshakeh." So there again you have a scribe and you have a recorder being mentioned as being present along with this group that's traveling around. So it just makes logical sense that they were actually recording stuff at this time. This all goes against the theory that it was written much later and it is just a big story that was designed by somebody, who was reflecting on the history of Israel but didn't actually know any of these events. There's actual recorders along the way who are making documentation of what's going on. Here's a random question. I don't even know if I understand it. User 93 says, "Please explain if Bible and God are correct. Why no mention of indigenous or Asians?" Well, the Bible and God are correct, but what you're calling indigenous and Asians would have been people groups that would have split off from the Tower of Babel and been given their own language and their own identity and traveled around the world at that time. And the Bible only follows one people group out of all these different nations. The Bible is certainly not supposed to be a comprehensive history of the entire world, not even close. It's actually an extremely limited history of a very tiny group of people that just happen to encounter big empires and strange events, and God is leading them through different things, and God is choosing them for the Messiah to come. But it is not pretending to be a history of, Asians, indigenous, North Americans, Europeans, all these other people. So Eastern 93 says, so extremely limited in fact and truth. Yes, in a sense, you could say that the Bible is extremely limited truth. But if it wasn't, just so you know, just so you're aware of it, it would be billions of books long. It would be impossible to even have a record that long. It would be hundreds of millions of libraries full of irrelevant information about things that nobody cares about, that people would have had to hand transcribe and copy over every generation in order to maintain the knowledge that was recorded at some point. Walk Amongst Us says, but truth nevertheless, 100%. Well, yes, that's the point, is that this is what the God of all creation was interested in following up on. He was doing stuff around the world. God was active around the whole world. But the main storyline, so to speak, is this story. So you're following the protagonists of the story. You're not following the side characters. And you can say that's insulting to other cultures, but they did have their own records, and a lot of them line up with what the Bible says. It's not, it's not supposed to be a history of the whole world, but it is the truth. And you notice that there's a shared story in Noah's flood, for example, that amazingly lines up with all these other mythologies across the whole world, where at that time mankind was all bottlenecked at the Noah's family, and it just so happens that's the most universal ancient story, origin story of every nation, basically, is this giant cataclysm or flood that some people survive from, and then they rebuild from there. So Wealthgistics says, I had to look it up. The three main books of Solomon: Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. Well, we're going to read a little bit more about that. We're getting close to the wisdom literature of Israel, which is the next section. It's actually, we're on the last paragraph of this one about the prophets. So we're learning that there were these recorders that were actually traveling along with the prophets and the king's court and the important people. They had their own recorders. So the fact that they made records is in the Bible. And we would expect that information to have been incorporated into anyone making later records. The priests and the prophets, the same men often uniting both characters, laid the foundations of the historical literature of Israel, as the monks did in the history of medieval Europe. Interesting. So, priests and prophets were sort of together writing histories, or rather writing parts of histories that would become what he calls the foundation, laid the foundation of the historical literature of Israel. This is what I've sort of been the most interested in from the beginning is, was Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy ever written, like people say it was written by Moses, but it looks here like that's not what he's saying. There wasn't one guy that went and wrote all this stuff. There was key things they did record, and then there were records being made along the way, and they were preserving those as they traveled along and honored the memory of these different things. But the historical literature of Israel would have been compiled into what we know as those books by a later group. And that, to be honest, that is a scary thought to me, because of the fact that it means that somebody else later could go and add in some interpretation along the way. But let's see what he says. In addition to their work as preaching the word of Jehovah, they left their impress on the music and psalmody of the people, on its battle songs and lamentations, and delighted to trace out the sequence of events in the history of the people as indicating the conditions of true greatness and the fulfillment, more or less complete, of the laws of a righteous government. So these recorders and priests and prophets not only recorded stuff, but they framed it in a historical context, and they framed it as the fulfillment of, how they had these great laws and a righteous government, and they could accomplish great things. I'm not sure I buy that quite, because of the amount of self-criticism that is in the Old Testament, in the Torah, in the first 5 books. It doesn't feel like it's just about having righteous government, although I guess at the time of David, which is what he's really talking about, the prophets and David, it was a lot of positive stuff, and then after Solomon is where it really went downhill. So now let's look at the next section. I'm keeping an open mind here. I'm trying to learn, but I'm also just keeping an open mind. I'm not buying it immediately. The 6th section of his commentary here is the wisdom literature of Israel. It says, the accession of Solomon opened yet another region of culture, the world of nature, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop on the wall, which is said in 1 Kings 4:33, the apes and peacocks from the far east, the gold and precious stones from Ophir, the tin that came from Tarshish, also known as Spain. Oh, I didn't know that. Apparently, Spain is Tarshish. Nobody's ever told me that before. Presented objects for a natural, almost for a scientific curiosity, which led to registering phenomena and inquiring into their causes. Contact with nations of other races and creeds, a wider experience of the chances and changes of human life, led to the growth of an ethical wisdom, which, after the manner of the East, embodied itself in the form of proverbial maxims. Interesting. So he's saying that Solomon, because he was such a multicultural, he married so many different women from different kingdoms, he was all about trying to reach out and understand the world and promote himself and Israel to these other countries, but also incorporate their knowledge into his reign It led to an ethical wisdom, which then became the Proverbs, and he's saying that's the manner of the East. What would the East have been at that time? Because Egypt is west of Israel, and the East is Babylon, right? The East is, that's basically the Babylon region, the Assyrians, and so forth. So I'd be curious how that lines up. He says, here also we have traces of a far wider literature than that which now remains with us. But a comparatively small portion of the 3,000 Proverbs of Solomon survives in the book which bears that title. That book also, including also, one, a collection of maxims that was made in the reign of Hezekiah, which is Proverbs 25 to 29, and Proverbs apparently from the wisdom of other countries that bear the names of Agur and Lemuel, Proverbs 30 and Proverbs 31. Good morning, Henry and Susie. Shadow Raid Legend says China. I don't think, I never got the sense in the Bible, like when they talk about the East, that they're talking about the Far East, you know? Like, I feel like they basically never interact with China. Lemuel says, hey, my name. Yeah, that's right. Let me see. In Proverbs 31, it says, the words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. So Proverbs 31. Go look up what the Proverbs are of King Lemuel. It says, to this period and these influences we may probably assign also, if not the authorship, yet the appearance in the literature of Israel of the grand drama which we know as the Book of Job, dealing with the problem of man's life and the moral government of God from another standpoint than that of the Mosaic law. And the poem also dramatic in form and portraying, at least in its outer framework, the working of human love and its triumph over many obstacles, which we know as the Song of Solomon. What does he say about the book of Job? To this period and these influences we may probably assign also, if not the authorship, yet the appearance in the literature of Israel, the grand drama we know as the book of Job. So he's saying that somebody else may have written the book of Job, but it would have only appeared in Israel at the time of Solomon. Maybe because he's reaching out across all these different cultures and getting influenced by all these different cultures and incorporating it into Israel's literature. Oh, Lemuel, you already knew. It was your favorite chapter in the Bible. Sam and Mickey says that, haha, fun. Lemuel, my parents named me after that chapter, and there is a claim that Lemuel is actually King Solomon. Okay. Never heard that, but Debbie says, hello to you, Mr. Wolf. Hello, Debbie. Wealthgistic says, i.e. Phoenicians, while Josephus's identification of Tarshish, Sicilian city of Tarsus, South Spain. The Phoenicians, yeah, I keep hearing about the Phoenicians. I need to do research on that yet. I don't know almost anything about the Phoenicians. It's such a... It feels like everybody knows about them except me. I need to look it up yet. Especially for the book that I'm writing right now. So it says, to this period and these influences we could assign the book of Job and the Song of Solomon. but that it's not necessarily Solomon that wrote it. He would have just taken it at that time. He would have incorporated it. And then he says, Ecclesiastes, though purporting to be the work of Solomon, belongs in the judgment of most critics to a later date, and is therefore not mentioned in the text as belonging to the Solomonic literature. I don't like that. I don't like that. I want Ecclesiastes to be written by Solomon. I don't like... I mean, of course, what am I going to do? Am I going to disagree with him? Of course, most scholars I know do say that it wasn't written by Solomon, but Ecclesiastes was my favorite book of the Bible, and I really believe that Solomon actually wrote it. And he's just going along with the idea that it's not actually written by them. I was hoping he would have a defense for the idea that Ecclesiastes actually could have been written by Solomon, but it looks like he's not even going to try that. That's really unfortunate for me, because I'm such a fan of that book. Laughing Home says, good morning. Good morning. Now we're already through the wisdom literature. We're going to go to what is called the Law Forgotten. It says, so far the literature that thus grew up was in harmony with the faith in Israel, but its wider and more cosmopolitan character tended to a greater laxity. And it would seem that in the course of time, there came to be a natural conflict between the new literature and the old, as there was between the worship of Jehovah as the Son of God in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that of Moloch and Chemosh, of Baal and Ashtaroth, which formed one of the perils of this wider culture, and to which kings like Solomon, Ahaz, and Manasseh gave wrongful preference. The book of the law of the Lord, in whatever form it then existed, fell into comparative oblivion. The Reformation under Jehoshaphat brought it again into a temporary prominence, which we read in 2 Chronicles 17, verse 9, which says, and they taught in Judah, and they had the book of the law of the Lord with them, and went about throughout all the cities of Judah, and taught the people. Oh, okay. So that king actually decided to bring out the old book of the law of the Lord and teach it to the people. And it says, and it is natural to assume that a devout king like Hezekiah, cultivating as he did both the psalmody and the sapiential literature, which were identified with the faith of Israel, and guided by a teacher like Isaiah, would not be neglectful of the older books, which was the groundwork of both. So he's saying King Hezekiah would have preserved and taught the book of the law of the Lord, even though it wasn't popular. The long reign of Manasseh, however, did its work alike of destruction and suppression, when the book of the law of the Lord was discovered in some secret recess in the temple during the progress of Josiah's reformation. It burst upon the people with its warnings and its woes, with the startling terrors of an unknown portent. What that book was is one of the problems which must be reserved for discussion in its proper place in the course of this commentary. Wow, what is he talking about? It may have been the whole Pentateuch as we now have it, or as the prominence given to its prophecies of evil might indicate, the book of Deuteronomy as the work of Moses, or, as the bolder criticism of our time has suggested, the work of a contemporary who, confident that he was reproducing the mind of Moses, that the spirit of the lawgiver was speaking through him, did not hesitate to assume his character and speak as in his name, as at a later date. Certainly in the book of wisdom, and possibly also Ecclesiastes, the teachers of wisdom spoke with no fraudulent animus in the name of Solomon. Oh, man. I don't know if you guys are following this, but this is really troubling and challenging for me. Baoli asks, why do you like Ecclesiastes so much? I can tell you that. Godlove says, why this said that? The Most High gave Solomon wisdom beyond measure. He was wise after the Most High, of course. And Shadow Raid says, why does the writer of the article call the law of the Lord, call it the law of the Lord instead of the law of Jehovah? I think that's because in the King James Version of the Bible that seems like he's using, it is called the book of the law of the Lord. Like in 2 Chronicles 17, verse 9. It's just called in the English translation the book of the law of the Lord. I think that's all he's trying to say, although Lord is capital L-O-R-D, But I see what I'm getting here is this whole chapter, this whole section is called The Law Forgotten. And that's very, in a way, it makes perfect sense because we know that after Solomon, the kingdom declined. We know that they turned away from God. Solomon himself turned away from God and served other gods. And we know that, therefore, they wouldn't have been teaching the law, of course. Because if they had been teaching the law, they would have been worshiping the God of Israel. So it actually makes perfect sense that they wouldn't have created a lot of literature that we would end up having in the Bible at that time, because although they would have still had royal record keepers, which is why maybe we have the book of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles and stuff, but that ultimately this was a time of neglecting the law, with a couple of exceptions who came and found the book of the law of the Lord, whatever that is. He's suggesting that it might be the first 5 books of the Bible as we have it, or just Deuteronomy. Or he's saying, and he calls this the bolder criticism of our time. And I wonder, when did this guy actually write this? I thought it was the early 1900s. Charles John Ellicott, compiler and contributor to this renowned Bible commentary, was one of the most outstanding conservative scholars of the 18th century. That's the 1700s. He was born in Whitwell near Stamford on April 25th, 1819. Well, that would be the 19th century, wouldn't it? I think that's the 19th century. He graduated from St. John's College, Cambridge, where other famous expositors like Charles Simeon and Handley Moleston. Okay, so from 1841 to 1848, he served as the rector of such and such. So the mid-1800s. And he's saying that at the bolder criticism of his time was suggesting that there was somebody who came by later and called themselves Moses and Solomon and wrote Ecclesiastes and wrote a new version of the law, but that the real law given was what? Lost? I hope he's not suggesting that the original book of the law of the Lord and its essential contents was lost, and that somebody later went and basically tried to recompile it or rediscover it. Let's go to the next section. The literature of the northern kingdom. It lies in the nature of the case that we have fuller materials for tracing the history of Hebrew literature in the kingdom of Judah than that of Israel. Remember, the kingdom splits into northern Israel and southern Judah after Solomon. The culture of the northern kingdom was of a lower type. The apostasy of Jeroboam alienated from the outset the priests and the Levites, who supplied the chief materials of a learned class, and the lowest of the people, who were made priests of the high places and of the calves of Bethel and Dan, were not likely to supply its place. 1 Kings 12:31, and he made a house of high places and made priests of the lowest of the people, which were not of the sons of Levi. It says that right in 1 Kings 12:31. So he just made any old person a priest, and that they wouldn't have had the knowledge and wisdom and education to be able to make good literature and records. It says, but here also it must be remembered that there were official historiographers attached to the royal court, schools of the prophets, which, under the guidance of Elijah and Elisha, maintained the worship of Jehovah as hymn writers and as preachers, writers of songs for the feasts of princes and of nobles, of a far other character than that of the songs of Zion. And then he references Amos 6 and Amos 8. In Amos 6 verse 5 it says, this chant to the sound of the viol, and invent to themselves instruments of music like David. And Amos 8 says, and I will turn your feasts into mourning, and all your songs into lamentation, and I will bring up sackcloth on all loins, and baldness on every head, and I will make it as the mourning of an only son, and the end thereof as a bitter day. Okay, so he's going to turn the songs into a lamentation. So he's referencing that they would have, anytime it mentions songs, basically, it would be a way of saying that they were recording their history at that time, because you don't make songs without writing it down. That's been his argument, and I think it's a pretty logical one. It says probably even a literature as profligate and as skeptical as that of the European Renaissance. Elijah and Elisha maintained the worship of Jehovah as hymn writers and preachers. Probably even a literature as profligate and as skeptical as that of the European Renaissance. Hosea 8 verse 12 says, I have written to him the great things of my law, but they were counted as a strange thing. Yeah. I have written to him, that means it was written down, the things of my law, but they were counted as a strange thing. And in Hosea 9 it says, they have deeply corrupted themselves as in the days of Gibeah. Therefore he will remember their iniquity, he will visit their sins. And that is speaking to the fact that this was a bunch of prophets who were skeptical and critical of their own people. Guys, thank you for the 3,000 likes on TikTok. If you want to boost that up, that helps the stream. It helps promote it to more people. I'm learning a lot here. I'm nerding out here, and it's challenging me, but I'm interested. If you're on YouTube and you have the like button there, the thumbs up, go ahead and hit the like button there. And if you have questions, I'm not checking the chat constantly, but I am checking it in between. So if you're as curious as I am to just keep going, I will certainly keep going. It says, the conquest of the kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians, the events which we sum up as the captivity of the 10 tribes, swept off alike the good and the evil elements of that literature. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. If, as in the case of some of the Psalms, probably Psalms 80, and the writings of prophets like Hosea and Amos, whose lives and work were cast in the northern kingdom, some of it has survived, and it was probably because of the remnant of Ephraim that was left took refuge in Judah, which is mentioned in 2 Chronicles 30:18. It says, for the multitude of the people, even many of Ephraim and Manasseh, Issachar and Zebulun, had not cleansed themselves, yet did they eat the Passover otherwise than it was written. Yet did they eat the Passover otherwise than it was written. But Hezekiah prayed for them, saying, the good Lord pardon every one. So these refugees from the northern kingdom had a different way of doing Passover, but the good king Hezekiah prayed that God would still pardon them, I guess. It says, they took refuge in Judah at a time when Hezekiah was carefully gathering up, as we have seen in the case of the book of Proverbs, all fragments that remained of the older and nobler literature of the people, that nothing might be lost. So Hezekiah is the one who goes and gathers the fragments of older material, because there's been a bunch of corrupt kings, and he doesn't want it to get lost because he knows it's starting to fade away, I guess. All right, we're going to keep going. We're on the next section already. The Babylonian Exile. Shadow Raid Legend says, that's my favorite refute to legalism. Even though that they were not fully obedient to the Torah, it was still pleasing to God since their hearts were toward him. You're absolutely right. I mean, we can see it in different places, but that's a big one, because these weren't, preferred people even. These were refugees, right? So they come in not doing things correctly, and they're still given mercy, and it's apparently pleasing to God. And legalism would have you believe that basically no matter how much you're trying to please God, he doesn't care unless you're doing everything according to the law as they understand it. The Babylonian Exile. Okay, you guys ready for this one? We've actually gone through a lot of different sections here. It says the capture of Jerusalem by the Chaldeans, meaning the Babylonians. The more modernly accurate term for the Babylonians is the Chaldeans. The capture of Jerusalem by the Chaldeans under Nebuchadnezzar must have wrought a like destruction in Judah or Jerusalem. The royal library of Jerusalem, of which we possibly find a trace as suggesting the symbolism of the house of wisdom with its 7 pillars. Proverbs 9 verse 1 says, wisdom has built her house, she has hewn out her 7 pillars. That could be a reference to a library. Must have perished in the flames, as that of Alexandria. At a later period did under Omar, and with it much that which would have thrown light on the history and religion of Israel, passed away, never to be recovered. All, however, was not lost. The most precious books were, as in all ages, not those that were only in the shelves at a public library, but those that were treasured up by individual men as the guides and counselors of their life. The priests, Levites, prophets, and psalmists of Israel carried with them into Babylon the books which they held most sacred. I think that's a fantastic point. And I think he's being very realistic here. I can see why they call him a conservative scholar, because he's not going out on a crazy limb here. He's giving credit to the fact that sometimes bad things happen and you lose something that would have been important. God didn't miraculously preserve every single thing that Israel ever created. He allowed a lot of their history to be destroyed and lost. It says, they were known to have with them the songs of Zion, Psalm 137, verse 3, which says, For there they carried, man, I'm so bad at reading today. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us the songs of Zion. Okay, so the Babylonians wanted the Jews to sing the songs of Zion, which implies that they had with them psalms that they took from Jerusalem, and then they made a psalm about that. So that becomes its own psalm. And were expected to sing them at the bidding of their conquerors. A priest prophet like Ezekiel may have had with him the book of the law to which he appeals in Ezekiel 5 verse 6, where he says, And she has changed my judgments into wickedness more than the nations, and my statutes more than the countries that are round about her. For they have refused my judgments and my statutes, they have not walked in them. And Ezekiel 20 says, And I give them my statutes, and showed them my judgments, which if a man do, he shall even live in them. Okay. The book of the law to which he appeals, the documents which served as the basis of his ideal realization of the Holy Land, of Jerusalem, and of the temple, Ezekiel 40 to 48. A scribe like Baruch, over and above his work as committing to the writing of the prophecies of his master Jeremiah, Jeremiah 36 verse 4 and Jeremiah 36:32, was not likely to be unmindful of the books which, like Deuteronomy and some of the earlier prophets, formed the basis of that master's teaching. A prince like Daniel, skillful in all wisdom and cunning in knowledge and understanding science, Daniel 1 verse 4, which says, Children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Must, in the nature of the case, have been trained in the books in which the wisdom of his people was enshrined. So he's arguing that because it mentions that Daniel was wise and had this knowledge, and he was familiar with science, but also wisdom, and knowledge, you would have got that from books, and that therefore those books must have survived the destruction of Jerusalem, and Daniel would have been one of these people that preserved his collection enough that he could have that. And it says, to the influence of these three men at the beginning of the captivity, it was, we may believe, due that the Jewish exiles did not shrink into a degraded and unlettered caste. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That they preserved preserved what they could of the sacred books of their fathers, now more precious to them than ever. Under their training, or at least with the memory of their work ever before his eyes, grew up the man whose relation to these books is absolutely unique. So that's how he describes the Babylonian exile. It's interesting that he doesn't even mention the idea of the Babylonian exiles writing a bunch of false things and fake literature and false prophecies and apocrypha. I guess he's just talking about where the books of the actual Bible come from for the most part, and not concerning himself with all the extra stuff that he could mention. Because from what I understand in the Babylonian exile, there's a lot of nonsense written as well. But he's making some great points, and he's pointing to Bible verses to make his points. When it mentions that there's a scribe or a recorder, or that there are songs of Zion, for example, that means there must have been songs that survived into the Babylonian exile. But he's also saying that there was tons of stuff that was probably lost in the destruction of Jerusalem, including the royal library of Jerusalem, much like the Library of Alexandria that was destroyed. Okay. Now the work of Ezra. I've never been a fan of Ezra. I got to be honest. But let's see what he says about the work of Ezra. Round the name of Ezra there has gathered much that is obviously legendary and fantastic. But the traditions, wild as they are such as cluster round the memory of a great man, and indicate the character of his work. That's a fair point. I mean, it would suggest that there was a real Ezra, and that he was a great man. It says, to him, according to those legends, it was given to dictate, as by special inspiration, all the sacred books that had been destroyed by fire and perished from the memories of men. What? Wait. Am I crazy? Or is he referencing stuff that's not even in the Bible? Yeah, he's referencing stuff that's not in the Bible. Okay. Second Esdras and 14 verse 21, which says, for thy law is burnt, therefore no man knoweth the things that are done of thee, or the work that shall begin. And second Esdras 14 verse 44 says, in 40 days they who wrote 204 books. So apparently Ezra is known for, in an apocryphal writing, which he calls legendary and fantastic, meaning not legendarily good and fantastically well done, but legend and fantasy, that they wrote 204 books in 40 days that restored everything that was destroyed in the fire of Jerusalem. Okay. It says he had, besides this, dictated to an esoteric circle of disciples 70 other books of a mystic and apocalyptic character. Second Esdras 14 verse 46 says, but keep the 70 last, that thou mayest deliver them only to such as be wise among the people. He was the president of the great synagogue, which included every notable name of the period, and to which the traditions of later rabbis assigned the whole work of the restoration of religion at Jerusalem, the institution of synagogues, the settlement by authority of something like a canon of books that were to be accounted sacred. In the more authentic records of his work, okay, good. So that was all just tradition. I I was getting confused here. Like, he's saying this is fantasy and legend, but he's also kind of saying this is what the guy actually was. But he's alluding to the fact that there was such legends around him that, and this is why I said I didn't like Ezra, is that it felt like a lot of stuff that I've heard about him is like, he's supposedly this godly man, but there's a bunch of lies around him. And I guess what he's saying is, yeah, there was lies around him, but they were based on something real because he was a real guy who did some great things. We just don't know what it is because of all these crazy traditions. And I guess that's kind of what he was saying about Solomon as well. And so it says, in the more authentic records of his work is naturally confined within narrower limits, but it lies in the same direction. He brings the people together on his return to Jerusalem and has the book of the law read to them publicly, which is Nehemiah 8, 1-5. And all the people gathered themselves together as one man into the street that was before the water gate. And they spoke to Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded to Israel. That's in Nehemiah 8, 1-5. And appoints interpreters to expound its meaning. Nehemiah 8, verse 8. And cause the hearers to understand the reading. It is an open question whether their work was confined to translating from the older Hebrew into the later Aramaic, which became from this time the spoken language of the Jews. Oh, that's when it became Aramaic. I didn't know that. I knew it became Aramaic, but I didn't know it was at this time. Or extended to a paraphrase of the text, such as afterwards took shape in the books known as the Targums, interpretations or paraphrases. See, I was just researching this. I'm so glad I'm reading this commentary. This is connecting chronologically a lot of stuff I had heard here and there, and it was confusing to me. I had heard of Targums. I knew that Targums were reinterpretations of the books of the Bible, the older books of the Bible, and that it was in Aramaic. And I'm like, where did this come from? Who created these things? And where did that tradition begin? Why was it not counted as heresy and blasphemy to paraphrase the Torah? And yet, we know that became a tradition. And he's saying that it may have started here with Ezra. In any case, the work of Ezra as the restorer of the religion of Israel must have been one of immense importance. To him, with scarcely a shadow of a doubt, we owe the preservation of the books which we now have as the anthology of a wide literature. The reliquis, oh, that's some Latin term. I'm not going to be able to read that. The something of older days of Israel, probably completion out of many documents of the book of Kings and Chronicles, one from the prophetic, the other from the priestly standpoint, one dealing generally with the history of both Israel and Judah as the record of the divine government of the people, and the other more fully with that of Judah only. Wow, okay. So he's saying that Ezra came out of Babylon and he managed to recover and restore enough of the former texts that were almost lost in the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon, that basically everything that has survived until the time of Jesus and then onward till today would have been stuff that Ezra decided or managed to actually preserve. And that if it's true, if there's any truth in the fact that he created synagogues and rabbi and you know what would be later become rabbis and sort of a tradition of keeping the literature intact, we basically owe the Bible, the Old Testament, to Ezra. See, I don't like that because I've never liked Ezra. Thank you guys for the 7,000 likes. We're being very nerdy today, and I'm not taking a lot of questions, but you guys are hanging in here, and we're learning stuff, and we're learning, I think, very important stuff. I am certainly going to be incorporating this into what I'm writing in my book right now because it's going to deal with this. It says to him, okay, yeah, I read that already. Sandy says it doesn't sit right. I know, right? Mickey says, wow, Ezra, really? I mean, he is called a scribe, and it's clear that he does say in Nehemiah that he brought out, because Nehemiah is in the Bible, right? It's Ezra and Nehemiah are basically one set of books, and it's all about them coming out from Babylon and trying to recover the law and recover everything they lost and restore Jerusalem, restore Israel. So there's no doubt that that happened and that they tried to create a new culture of basically exalting the written law, the Torah, and exalting these ancient writings. But I'm still not sure if he's trying to say that the narrative that goes from Genesis to Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible, was created by Ezra. Because he already previously mentioned the idea that somebody else had gone by and basically imitated Moses and tried to recover that point of view or something. That sounded like some sort of kind of wacky theory. But the idea that they had lost so much with the northern kingdoms being destroyed and then the southern kingdom of Judah being destroyed, and that they basically, whatever they could carry, that is what they actually brought into Babylon. So there would have been this limited literature that brought there. And that 70 years later, when they come out, they have this new appreciation of the text. See, but the thing is that the Bible never says that Ezra spoke to God or that God spoke to Ezra. That's actually one of my biggest problems with Ezra. I read Ezra and Nehemiah, and I'm like, God never speaks to this guy. He's not a prophet. He's a scribe. And yet in the legends, apparently from 2nd Esdras, which I've never, it's not in the Bible, you know, that he's the one that was given to dictate by special inspiration all the sacred books that had been destroyed by fire and perished from the memories of men. And that he had dictated to an esoteric circle of disciples 70 other books of a mystic and apocalyptic character. And this scholar is saying that that's nonsense, but that there must be something to it because of the fact that there were legends around him. That's so rough. I don't know if I can just accept that. God Love says, you are so funny, Terry Wolf. One day you are going to meet Ezra. You're going to say on his face, I don't like you. Wow, you're bold. Find forgiveness in your heart. I'm not accusing him of sin, but, you know, I don't have to like every person in the Bible. I mean, do I? I think I'm allowed to criticize, some of the characters in the Bible, the people that existed. If it's true that Ezra is this person who did so many incredible things, I will gladly swallow my words and apologize. But the fact that the Bible doesn't record God ever talking to him, and yet he's said to have been specially inspired to write all these sacred books and restore Jerusalem, that sounds like propaganda. And then Nehemiah is likewise not, God never speaks to him either. Man. Okay, let's just keep going, and we'll see where this commentary goes. The next section is the completion of the Old Testament canon. Okay. So he says, as yet, however, we do not find, except in relation to the book of the law, the idea of a closed canon, to which no addition could rightfully be made. Bailey asks, was Ezra ever a king? I don't believe Ezra was a king. I think the first king was it Jeroboam, or was it, who was that king? I don't know who the king was. Ezra was just a scribe. I believe he talked to the Persians and the rulers and of the other people, and he was definitely a major player, but he wasn't the king. The king was the king that came out of Babylon was the grandson of the former king. And the high priest they had was the high priest of the former high priest. They tried to take the grandchildren of the former, rulers, and then just make them the rulers. I think that's how it went. God Love says, I don't like the wicked ones in the Bible, but the person that served the Most High, we need to bless and respect. Bless your heart, Terry Wolf. Bailey says, maybe a fan of his wrote that book. Yeah. I mean, I'm just processing this. I've never heard this before. It's shocking to me that was even a rumor, that he did all these amazing things. When I read Ezra and Nehemiah, I've said this before, I don't get the sense that God was particularly blessing them. I don't think that those books are full of lies per se, but it's like they don't even pretend in those books that God responds to their prayers. All right, we're just going to keep going. The completion of the Old Testament canon. We do not find, except in relation to the book of the law, the idea of a closed canon to which no addition could rightfully be made. Not to speak of the writings which belong to Ezra's own period, and in some of which he probably took part as a compiler, editor, or writer. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the prophecies of Haggai and Zechariah, the Psalm of the Babylonian exiles, the book of Kings and Chronicles, the book of King and Chronicles, this parentheses is out of place here. I don't think that belongs to anything. We have, of a later date, the history of Esther and the prophecy of Malachi. In the judgment of many scholars, the book of Daniel belongs wholly or in part to the time of the Maccabees. What? The book of Daniel belongs wholly or in part to the time of the Maccabees. And some of the Psalms are ascribed by not a few critics to the same period. I don't know, Mr. Ellicott. I mean, it's true that that's what many scholars might say, but what do you say? What's the evidence against it? Daniel was written by the Maccabees revolt, and that's why it mentions stuff that leads to Rome, because Rome was already in power at the time. It's not a prophecy at all, really. It's just something somebody wrote and attributed to Daniel, and that's why it's so up to date and it seems so prophetic, is because it was written hundreds of years later, 300 or 400 years later, by somebody who knew the history and therefore could make it sound like it was a prophecy that had been fulfilled. Inzam says, God knew what our final product would be. It happened for a reason. All right, well, it says, and some of the Psalms are ascribed not by a few critics to the same period. The authorship of Ecclesiastes has been brought by some critics as low as the reign of Ptolemy Philopater, by others even to that of Herod the Great. Man, they're really slamming Ecclesiastes here. I don't know, man. These scholars, I'm a fundamentalist. I don't want to hear any of this. An open canon. Everything that was ancient was actually destroyed. Some guy made up everything Moses wrote and pretended to be him. Ecclesiastes was written in the time of Herod the Great. Daniel was written by the Maccabees. Ezra went and restored all the ancient writings, but that's just a fantasy, so really no, and that means it's even less authoritative. Not happy. Sandy says, I give God more credit for protecting his word. Well, that's how I feel. Wealthgistics says, is there a source or notes or references for this chapter in back? I'm not reading if you mean if he's providing sources, no, this is just a commentary that he's written, and he's said already in the introduction of it that there's a much bigger commentary that he'll get around to later, but that this is just a summary of basically his findings. And to be fair, he's saying this is what scholars say. And he says the authorship of Ecclesiastes has been brought by some critics as low as the reign of Ptolemy Philopater, by others even to that of Herod the Great. So he's acknowledging that these are things scholars have said. He's not the one saying he thinks this is true. And let's see if he can bring it back somehow or make some sort of apology or defense for the Bible here, because I feel like this is basically taking the Bible and just throwing it in the trash. I mean, what is the point of the Bible if this is how it came about? He's basically tracked how everything got lost, and now he's saying that some of its most important books came out of completely different time periods from guys who did not have the spirit of prophecy and just basically were writing propaganda. I mean, he's made a lot of good points so far. I hope he can bring it back. God left says lots of confusion. I mean, yeah, this is the world of scholarship. This is why I wanted to read this. I wanted to read this because I'm tired of on the one hand, hearing people say the Bible is completely false and it's all made up and it's all lies, and as if they know what they're talking about. And on the other hand, having Bible teachers and preachers and local church pastors and stuff say every single word of it is completely inspired by God and it was all given to Moses and he wrote the first 5 books of the Bible exactly as it is, and then the rest of it was perfectly this and that, and that also sounds like a crazy story. I want to understand and be able to start to at least think of what a realistic explanation for the Bible is. And I'm okay with the idea that different parts of the histories were being written by different people, like these prophets that went around with music and wrote poems that became the Psalms, but they also wrote histories, and that there was all these books. And to be fair, he showed that there are books referenced in the Bible, like the stuff of like Nathan the prophet. The history of Nathan the prophet is referenced right in the Bible, but we don't have the history of Nathan the prophet. So it's mentioned in the Bible, but the book is not included in the Bible itself because it was lost at some point. So we know for a fact, according to the Bible, that certain important books were lost. But then later somebody came by and they took all these things and they said, okay, maybe at the time of King David or something, they said, we have all these parts of the history. Let's compile it into an actual story from Adam and Eve all the way to the Egyptian captivity, or to the giving of the law, and then to the entering the land of Canaan. And if you think of it that way, David was basically the guy that conquers the land and, settles Jerusalem, or I guess whatever. That happens with different people, but he ends up going and triumphing and becoming this king. And then he goes and the Torah, as we have it, could have been written around that time out of the books that Moses wrote, out of the books that the prophets wrote, and these different songs and records that they were keeping with them. And then David himself is a psalm writer. He's a big into literature. There's an explosion of literature at that time. And then Solomon goes and reaches out even further to all these other kingdoms and starts to incorporate wisdom, meaning when wisdom is usually a reference to written things and records and stuff, science and different discoveries and things. And then Solomon gets so deep into it that it ends up declining. The kingdom split apart. A lot of it is lost. The northern tribes lose a bunch of stuff. Their priests aren't even educated. The southern Judah is concerned with keeping it true. But then a lot of their literature is lost, but only basically the Torah is preserved as they go into Babylon. And then I guess the implication is the implication is not that Ezra and the people who came out of Babylon went and wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. They're saying that there was a bunch of other stuff that they also created and restored or whatever. Mickey says, disparaging God's word. I mean, these scholars, that's what they do. They don't consider it sacred, right? So to them, they're just saying, what do we see? What does the evidence show? And then they don't care if it's sacred or not. They're not like, well, it's God's word. It must be true, and it must be an accurate record, and it must be. They just go, they don't handle it with the same devotion that we would. Sandy says, then God would have just commissioned Ezra to write the whole thing in the first place. Timothy says, blessings. Bless you as well. Thank you for joining. Thank you for the 9,900 likes. If we could tip that over just a little bit, that would be pretty sweet. I am still having fun. And let me be clear, this is the kind of challenge I enjoy, but it is challenging. I'm deeply emotionally involved in, of course, the accuracy and the Bible. But this is exactly what I wanted from this commentary. I wanted to find out what do scholars actually say about the history, not from just a Jewish point of view, like in the Talmud, or from just a fundamentalist, Baptist sort of guy who's like a King James only guy, and he makes it sound like God wrote the King James Bible himself, and it's like there was no record before that. It was just that King James Bible came out of nowhere. And it's like, I know that's not true. And like, where did the history of the Old Testament come from is the whole point here. So I'm enjoying it, but it's very challenging, and I'm not accepting what he's saying. But I now have to consider it. Baoli says, if any of this were true, would it alter the Bible? And seeing that the Bible wasn't changed, although many scholars had fundamental issues with it, it means that all the arguments around it had no real footing, I guess. See, this is such a big part of the book that I'm writing. That's why I'm looking this stuff up. I want to look into these things. I want to understand why God decided to record history the way that he did. And, because he could have used better methods, like more logical methods that you or me would say that's a better way of doing it. But he chose to preserve his wisdom and his teachings this way. And I want to understand a little bit, at least, or be able to create a hypothesis of why he would do it that way. And I don't like to hear that Ecclesiastes was written at the time of Herod the Great or something like that. The book of Daniel being written at the time of the Maccabees, that pisses me off, because that means it's not actually a prophecy. And that means that they're implying that the rest of the prophecy isn't true either. It was written by some random guy who was trying to condemn Rome. And that feels to me like a bunch of atheist scholars going and saying, well, this book is so powerfully prophetic. If it was written at the time that Daniel was actually alive, it's so accurate, it's so powerful, that it must have just been written after these events. So when would be the time when it's the most accurate to write it? To be a retrospective as well as instead of a prophecy. And then they say, well, somewhere around the time of the Maccabean revolt. So let's say that it was written. It's just there to rationalize a prophecy. Mickey says, yep, they may as well be questioning the cross. That's how I feel. And Debbie says, I love the wrap-up you just did. It justifies digging more. Timothy says, it's been hidden, but now we are waking up and see the cover-up. Let's keep going here. It's not over yet. There's a lot more on this page. I don't know if it... Oh, he gets into the Masoretic Scribes and the Jewish classification of the Old Testament books. Let's get at least to the end of this section. Okay, so it says, in regard to the last named book, I think he's talking about Ecclesiastes, there are traces of a dispute among rabbis whether it was or was not to be admitted among the sacred books. Oh, the last named books. I think he's talking about the rabbinic decision to create the canon. So they were debating whether to include Ecclesiastes in the sacred books. And the same holds good, the difficulty in each case arising out of the contents of the book, of the Song of Solomon. The discussion ended, however, in the recognition of their claims, and at the time when the history of the New Testament opens, it may be fairly assumed that, for the Jews of Palestine at least, the books of the Old Testament were as we now have them, and were known as being emphatically the Scriptures, which is why Matthew, Luke refers to them as the Scriptures, as in Luke 24:32 that says, "And they said to one another, Did not our heart burn within us while he talked with us by the way, and while he opened to us the Scriptures?" And Matthew 22 says, "Jesus answered and said to them, You do err, not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of God." So they're just called the Scriptures, or the Holy Writings in 2 Timothy 3:15. And it says, they were divided popularly into law and prophets, or more fully into law, prophets, and the Psalms, like in Luke 24:44, which says, "And he said to them, These are the words which I spoke to you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses, and in the prophets, and in the Psalms concerning me." Wealthgistics says, yes, there's a hint of a power struggle going on behind the scenes, which also may be the point. It says, traces of a like classification are found in the preface to the apocryphal book of Ecclesiasticus, which is different from the book of Ecclesiastes, I know that, where we read the more vaguely the law, the prophets, and the other books. Upon these, the rabbis, first of Jerusalem and afterwards Tiberias and Babylon, concentrated their labors, which bore fruit in the Targumim and Midrashim. See, this is critical information. I don't know if you guys are following along with this, but I've been researching the Midrashim and the Targumim and how it relates with the Second Temple period and the post-Christian rejection of Jesus by the Pharisees and the rabbis and all that stuff. The first being on the nature of simple paraphrases intermingled as regards those of the later books of the Old Testament, with which much legendary matter and the Midrashim, or commentaries, which collect the often discordant expositions that had been given orally by the rabbis. That I knew for sure. The Midrash is a bunch of commentaries on the Old Testament that are full of nonsense. We did a whole study on the rabbinic Judaism and how full of lies it is. Hummingbird says, yes, the Bible is challenging for many to comprehend, such as Revelation, a dream full of symbolism. Absolutely, and I wrote a book on Revelation. The writings thus reverenced as the basis of Jewish education and were read in synagogues of Palestine. Under these, the Christ, as man, increased in wisdom and knowledge. These were the ultimate standard of appeal for apostles and evangelists. The argument of St. Paul in 2 Corinthians 3:14 and of the writer of the Epistle to the Hebrews fixed, for Christians at least, on the books thus collected the title of the Old Covenant, or the Old Testament, as distinguished from the New. So in 2 Corinthians 3:14 it says, "But their minds were blinded, for until this day remains the same veil not taken away in reading of the Old Testament, which veil is done away in Christ." Yeah, he's got a point. He does have a point. True Earth Man says, True Man says, Revelation is extremely easy to understand when you stop thinking about us. 70 AD, finished. Not if you actually read it. It's extremely easy to understand if you ignore 70% of it, because it doesn't line up at all with 70 AD. Preterism is not true. W. Hunt says, "Morning, are we continuing from yesterday?" Yes, we are. And we've gotten into some very deep waters, which is what I wanted. It's what I wanted. But I am upset. And now I have to process this and see where I can stand here. Because I don't doubt the Bible at all. The question is, do I reject all of this and say, I don't care what scholars say? I'm just going to believe that God did whatever he had to do, and the Bible's, maybe Ezra did write it all, or maybe, these guys just don't have the information and whatever. There's no doubt about the Bible in my mind. It's just, if you were to go along with this, how would you regard stuff like Genesis? Like, he basically hasn't dealt with who wrote Genesis. He's not really talking about it. Josephus confirms, as does Tacitus. History and the Bible confirm it's done. No, there's major things that the 70 AD preterism view doesn't account for at all. It's impossible. There's many things that are just, you have to twist it and stretch it and bend it and break it 7 different ways in order to get it to seem like it's what happens in Revelation. So it might have been a foreshadowing of things, but I have studied preterism. You say, you just have to read it. And not only did I read it, I wrote a whole book on Revelation. And I know it's very weak. No, I don't have to call Jesus a liar to believe that. Anyway, I'm not going to get into debate with a guy who doesn't understand things. Josephus enumerates 5 books of Moses, 13 prophets, in which the minor prophets are reckoned as a single book, and the historical books treated as prophetic, and 4 which contain hymns and a direction of life. The last group, which would seem to imply the non-recognition of some of the hagiographa, probably Ecclesiastes or the Song of Solomon. A list framed according to our present canon would give 5 such books, not 4. I mean, that's Josephus. Do we want to keep going today? We're at an hour and 38 minutes. We're getting into now, the next section is called Jewish Classification of the Old Testament Books. It's getting into the Masoretics and what they consider to be sacred, the Torah or law, the Pentateuch. I want to go a little bit further, but maybe I'll just skip some parts. It says, the sacred books received a new and more complete classification, which is retained in all existing copies, written or printed in the Hebrew text as follows. The Torah or law, wait, how is he writing this? In part, the principle of this classification is natural enough, but it presents some peculiarities. The fact that 5 books so dissimilar in character were grouped together under the title of Megilloth finds a possible explanation in the survival of some doubts, such as we have seen in the case of Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs, as to their full canonical authority. Perhaps also in the reverence for the mystical meaning of the number 5, as shown in the arrangement of the Pentateuch and the Psalms. And 2, the position of Daniel as separated from other prophets may possibly have had a like origin, the doubt in this case being strengthened for the later rabbis by the use made by Christians of its messianic predictions. See, that's something interesting, because the criticism of Daniel that it was written as late as the Maccabeans is because of the fact that it's so powerful and talks about the Messiah. It's such an important prophetic book that rabbis who hated Jesus didn't want it to be considered canonical, and they weakened its position. This is where the whole thing about all of this becomes increasingly political after Jesus. And then they go and retroactively say, well, no, this was that way, this was that way. And that's the thing. It's almost impossible to get a neutral opinion on the Bible and how things came about. W. Hunt says, God says in his word that we should compare it to what we hear in the world. Let's do that. True Earthman says, with someone you can't debate, so you dismiss. I don't really debate anyone. If you wanted to have a decent conversation and we could talk about it, I would. But you just said, I'm calling a Jesus a liar if I don't agree with you. So you see, you're the one that doesn't want to debate. You're the one that wants to shove preterism in my face and say, take it or leave it. You actually literally said the words, it's all or none. So you're being completely unreasonable and non-communicative and using provocative language for your point of view. I don't hate preterists, but I do hate the way that you're approaching the discussion. If you want to talk about it, I have reasons to back up why I think preterism is at best a cool interpretation of prophecy, and I think it deserves to be an attempt that people have made. But again, you're going all the way to, I'm calling Jesus a liar if I don't believe your crazy theory that ignores so much stuff in the book that I could point out to you, but you don't want to hear me do that. So I'm not going to debate somebody who's already coming in with that kind of arrogance. Debbie's asking, who is they? I don't know what you're referring to there. If you're asking me, I don't know what I said about they, but then he goes into the work of the Masoretic Scribes. They carefully revised the text, copying what they found in MSS. What is the MSS again? I knew that. I looked that up a little while ago. MSS. The MSS is the Greek Bible. Is that true? Greek. Manuscripts of the Bible. The Papyrus MSS. Does MSS just mean manuscript? I think it just means manuscript. Copying what they found in manuscripts of authority, even when they judged it faulty, under the title of Kathib or text to be written, while they wrote on the margin what seemed to them a preferable reading as the Cree or text to be uttered when the passage was read aloud. They introduced an elaborate system of subdivisions. The Pentateuch was divided into 54 parashioth or sections, the number of being chosen so as to give a lesson for synagogue use on each Sabbath of the Jewish intercalary year. Didn't know that. The division was probably in use from the time when the Torah was first publicly read in the synagogues. I don't really care about the synagogue Masoretic stuff as much. I think we're basically past the... Well, okay, I do want to know about the Septuagint, and that's what he's going to talk about here. The Septuagint version of the Old Testament. We must not forget, however, that for many centuries, the influence of the Old Testament in the Christian church was chiefly exercised through the medium of two versions, each of which calls for a brief notice. And one, there is the Greek version, commonly known as the Septuagint, and referred to more briefly as the LXX. The name, which LXX, I believe, is just the number 70, right? I think that's what it means. 5, 10, 10. So the L is 5, 10, 10, something like that. Or 50, 10, 10. And so it's 70 because there was, Septuagint means there were 70 scribes or whatever it was. It's a reference to 70. The name has its origin in a narrative or more or less a legendary which has come down to us bearing the name of Aristeas, who writes as an Alexandrian Jew. Ptolemy Philadelphus, king of Egypt, in BC 277, it was said, wished to enrich his library with a translation of the religious books of the Jews, who formed an important section of the population of his kingdom. With this view, he wrote to the high priest of the temple at Jerusalem, requesting him to send competent translators. 72 scribes of repute, 6 from each of the 12 tribes, were accordingly dispatched. They were received by the king on their arrival at Alexandria with every mark of honor, and separate chambers were assigned to them, in which each, apart from the others, with no communication between them, was to execute his task. They worked for 72 days, and when they met to compare the results of their labors, it was found, according to later form of legend preserved by Irenaeus, but not in the narrative of Aristeas, that they all agreed verbatim et literalem in the same version, meaning they did a perfect translation with no inconsistencies. The result was ascribed to the guidance of an immediate inspiration, and the book was accordingly received as having divine authority equal to that of the original. Over and above the introduction into this story of a supernatural element working contrary to the analogy of God's general method of revealing his will and wisdom to mankind, there are obviously many elements of improbability. Oops, I lost my place. Okay, here. It is not certain that the Hebrew canon of Scripture was, at this time, definitively settled. The narrative has a suspicious likeness to the legend already referred to, that of Ezra, that Ezra had from memory or by inspiration reproduced the whole of canon in its completeness. The volume now known includes many writings that are not in that canon, and some of which are confessedly of a later date. The authority of the version was never acknowledged by the Jews of Palestine. To them, this translation of the sacred books into the language of the heathen seemed an act of sacrilege, a sin as great as the worship of a golden calf. They appointed a day of fasting and humiliation to be held annually for this profanation, as they did for the destruction and desecration of the temple. Passing from legendary history to the safer region of reasonable conjecture, what probably occurred was this. Okay, so I like it when he just gives me his theory based on what he says is reasonable conjecture. I think reasonable conjecture is what I am interested in, but it's good to know that that was the legend. He says the Jews who had settled in Alexandria in great numbers and who occupied as they did afterwards at Rome, a distinct quarter of the city. So they basically had ghettos, they had their own section of the city. And they learned to speak and think in Greek. They lost their familiarity with the ancient Hebrew and with the Aramaic of the Targums. They wanted to read their sacred books, both privately and in the synagogues, in what was now their own language. The action of Ezra and his successors in paraphrasing or translating those books seemed to give a sanction to the principle of translation. The 5 books of the law, soon coming to be regarded as a single yet 5-fold volume known as the Pentateuch, were... Now that's important information. I'll highlight that. The 5 books of the law soon coming to be... That means it wasn't yet recalled a single 5-fold volume. Were as being read in the synagogues every Sabbath, the first to be translated, and were followed in due course by the prophets in the wider sense in which that name was employed in the Hebrew classification. The Ketubim, now known as to the Alexandrian Jews by the Greek equivalent of the Hagiographa, or Holy Writings, were, as far as we can judge, the last to come under the translator's hands. So the prophets were the last ones to be translated. It is probable enough that copies of the translation were placed in the royal library at Alexandria, and this served as a starting point for the legend of Aristeas. The want which was thus met at Alexandria was felt wherever the Jews, known as Hellenists, or Greek-speaking Jews, were settled in the cities of Asia, Greece, or Italy. Even in Palestine itself, Greek was freely spoken, and there were many synagogues at Jerusalem, as we see in Acts 6, verse 9, consisting entirely of these Hellenists. The natural result was that there was also a Septuagint version found the Septuagint version found acceptance with all but the more bigoted and prejudiced rabbis who, as we have seen, anathematized it. Its texts were freely quoted, we cannot doubt, in the disputes between St. Stephen and his opponents in those Hellenistic synagogues. Even St. Paul, though a Hebrew of the Hebrews, habitually used and quoted it. It served as the groundwork of religious education of Jewish children like Timotheus, who were growing up in heathen cities. It may have been familiar even to our Lord and to his Galilean disciples. Well. Laughing Home, I will try to have a blessed day. I think I'm going to wrap it up. But this has been this has been a lot of meat. This has been a lot to chew on. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to chew on this. I'm learning even if I disagree with some things or I just doubt some things, not like I can disagree with it from a scholarly point of view, but even if I just doubt some of the things that I've seen here, seeing something like the first 5 books of the law had not been considered a single volume divided into 5 parts, the Pentateuch, by the time the Septuagint was written, that is very important to me, because it means that those people who claim that it was written as one volume that is divided into 5 parts and it was all written at once by one guy, by people in Babylon or something like that, that those people are very likely completely full of it, because otherwise they would have known from the day one that it was just one book split into 5 parts written by the same guy, so that even by the time later when they're writing the Greek version, they still haven't considered it to be one volume. Bray says, "What are you reading, Mr. Wolf?" Good question. I am reading what is called Ellicott's Commentary for English readers. And Ellicott is Charles John Ellicott, who lived from the 1840s or early 1800s to, I don't know when he died, at least after the 1860s. So a mid-1800s commentary on the origin of the Old Testament. And he's going over basically where everything from the Old Testament came from, as best as scholars can tell. And of course, scholars are not theologians, right? Scholars are not going to go for that religious explanation. They're going to go for a historical, archaeological, what can we prove? What makes logical sense given secular material and evidence outside of the Bible, and not put that much emphasis on what is said in the Bible. But this guy is bringing up a lot of interesting points about how things came to be, and this Septuagint thing is also very important. So I'm definitely going to be referencing this and using this and giving my own thoughts on this, but let's see what he says here. It would be out of place to enter here into any detailed discussion of the merits of the Septuagint as a version, as a translation. It is not without the defects which attach in greater or less measure to all human workmanship. Sometimes, after the manner of the Targum, it gives a paraphrase instead of a translation, toning down strong expressions and removing difficulties. Sometimes it mistakes the meaning of the Hebrew, or appears to have been based on a different text from which the Masoretic scribes have handed down to us. Sometimes, notably in the history of Jeroboam and in some chapters of Daniel, as in Bel and the dragon, the history of the Susanna and the elders, and in some of the headings of the Psalms, it inserts what is not now found in the Hebrew text. In the case of Jeremiah, the whole arrangement of chapters differs from that of Hebrew. I didn't know that. Jeremiah in the Septuagint is completely rearranged. What is yet more noteworthy, it treats the Hebrew canon as one which was not yet closed, and includes in the same volume, and with no note of inferiority, books which are not found in it, and which are represented by what we now know as the Apocrypha. And these books being intermingled with the others, the order of the books is different from that of the Hebrews. He says of the Apocrypha, the word, which primarily means hidden or secret, was probably applied in the first instance to the books that claimed, like those alluded to in 2nd Esdras, a mysterious and esoteric character. When these came to be looked on as questionable authority, the word was used with a touch of sarcasm as equivalent to spurious. What? I didn't know that. The Apocrypha means hidden or secret, but that was actually a sarcastic way of saying that it's not true. Who would guess that? W. Hunt says, I found it on biblicalstudies.org. I found it on Bible Hub. They have a list of commentaries there, but it's good that you found it somewhere else. God Love says, that's why the Most High said, if you change my words or take out books, there's repercussions. Apocalypse. I paraphrase. Yeah, I think in Revelation there is a direct warning. You're not supposed to remove or add anything to that book. I don't think the same type of warning is given about the rest of the books, but certainly at some point, people became very protective of what is included or not as scholarship increased, and Jews and Christians both competed for authority on the same subject, so they both wanted to prevent the other guy from changing the scriptures. It says that it meant spurious. Another but less natural explanation is that the name indicated the fact that the books to which it applied were not like the canonical books read publicly in the church, but privately and in secret. I don't think that's a bad explanation, though. If it was hidden or secret, it would be stuff that you wouldn't tell the public because it wasn't authoritative. It would be something you read. Oh, but he's saying that, yeah, this view is saying that it was hidden in secret, but completely true and authoritative. And then that would include the Book of Enoch, or whatever the first version of the Book of Enoch was, right? PTP says, I thought the warning was for the entire Bible. Well, let's just look that up, because I don't want to... if it is for the entire Bible, I would be surprised. I don't remember ever seeing that, but I didn't look at it that closely. So here's what it says in Revelation 22. I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book, meaning Revelation. If anyone adds to them, God will add to him the plagues described in this book. And if anyone takes away the words of the book of this prophecy, God will take away his share in the tree of life and in the holy city, which are described in this book. Yeah, so it specifically says in this book, meaning the holy city that is described in Revelation, and, the plagues written in Revelation. That is Revelation. That's the last chapter of Revelation, Revelation chapter 22. And it is verse 18 and 19. So go to the end of the entire Bible, Revelation chapter 22, the last page, and read verse 18 and 19, and it tells you about adding and removing from this book, which can only mean Revelation, because most books of the Bible don't talk about the holy city. And he says that it was described in this book. But hey, I'm totally, personally, I support the idea that people who change the meaning of the Bible should be punished by God, but, or add or take away from it, I guess, is the more critical thing. Okay, guys, I'm going to have to shut it down. I need some sleep. It was a busy day at work, and I'm tired. But I did learn a lot, and more importantly, I now know that this commentary goes very far into controversial topics that I need to learn more about. So I am going to continue to try to digest this and match it up with some other stuff. Thank you for joining. Thank you for the 17,000 likes. That's a huge amount of likes. That's a lot. And I hope you enjoyed the study as much as I did. I got mad, okay? I got mad at the idea of Ecclesiastes and Daniel being written much later. I don't like it. I still don't like it. It doesn't mean I'm going to just dismiss it. It doesn't mean I'm going to accept it. I just don't like it, and I need to know what to do with that, and I'm going to pray about it. And let's all pray about it. Not that it's going to affect our salvation. You know, it's not a critical issue. Shadow Raid Legend says, I know Deuteronomy 4 verse 2 refers to adding and taking away from the commandments. I did not remember that, but Deuteronomy 4 verse 2. I'll quickly look that up just to satisfy those who are curious now. Deuteronomy 4 verse 1 says, And now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the rules that I am teaching you, and do them, that you may live, and go in and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you. You shall not add to the words that I command you, nor take from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you. Okay. Very nice. Deuteronomy 12 verse 32 as well. Let's look that up. Deuteronomy 12 verse 32. Everything that I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to it or take from it. You know, that's interesting because we know that they did add to it. But PTP says, yeah, I believe the Catholics removed the second commandment and changed the 10th commandment. I think you're right, actually. And, well, I know that you're right that they changed the commandments. I just don't know which ones. I think it was something about idolatry or something like that they changed. Anyway, guys, that's it. Thank you, God Love. Thank you, Baoli, Jacob. I didn't say hi to you before, but hi. This has been a challenging, interesting study. That's kind of how I like it. When I get nerdy and I want to go into a big study of something, I don't want it to be a piece of cake. I want to have to learn, you know, this reminds me of what I was doing in my study of Revelation. Like my feeling when I was writing the book on Revelation, maybe everyone is wrong. The feeling was, do I really have to go this far? Do I really have to actually tackle all of this? Do I have to learn about preterism and amillennialism and all these different things, and then find out whether they have a basis, and then all these types of things? So I'm getting the same feeling now. It's like, do I really need to know about the Midrash and, you know, all these things that were written here? Probably, and I'll probably be a better person for it on the other side, a better Bible teacher, and I'm allowed to have my own opinion on this stuff, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. I'll never be an expert on this stuff. I'm not going to go to a university and get proper scholarship training in it, but I'm at the point where I'm ready for this. I'm ready to get out of my comfort zone of just saying the Bible is however it came to be. I don't know, but you know, it's perfect and there's nothing, the history of it, you know, how did we get Genesis? You know, Moses just wrote it and he knew everything because God told him. I'm ready to go a little bit further into the realm of maybe there's a more rational explanation that God was involved with, of course, and then still give God maximum credit for how things turn out. But like we saw here, there are books referenced in the Bible itself that are not in the Bible. So we know that a bunch of stuff was lost. And so this confirms a lot of things that I was already looking into, but he's good enough to go era by era. And we read that whole thing about the prophetic song that we looked into yesterday. that was really interesting, and I had never thought of it at all. So this has been a very interesting study. Tomorrow I'm not going to do more of this on stream, because I feel like at this point I'm just going to be picking through the rest of the study he does and looking for some other stuff. But this is definitely a really good start to this sort of research, I feel like. So PTP says, yeah, the Bible isn't complete at all. We did a study on that subject at my church a few years ago. Yeah. Debbie says, lost or hidden. Well, I guess some of it was lost when the temple was destroyed, and some of it was maybe hidden by, unless you mean like God hid it for a reason, but that could be too. All right, guys, thank you for watching. Thank you for the 18,000 likes. Everyone on YouTube, thank you for joining. And I will come back tomorrow, God willing, at 6:30 a.m. And we can see what we're going to talk about there. I might do another live podcast. I'm not sure yet. Don't have to think about that now, so I'm not going to.